Hi, Malcolm.
Hey, Val.
How are you?
Oh, I can't hear you. Let me turn up my volume.
Oh, okay. It looks like I'm not
All
on
right,
mute.
let's see.
Okay. Hello and good day, everyone. Good day, good evening, and many good morning. Malcolm, of course, welcome to the CFFLive program. This is our regular Tuesday program where we are trying to get a lot of the leaders' collective thoughts, aggregated into this whole learning and book of knowledge that we have, and probably we are taking on from our experiences over responding to the COVID-19 and the new norm that's evolving, and also there is so much going on around us. I hope everybody's safe and in good health. I hope you are able to continue on with your work and life as we kind of go through these difficult times. A lot of us have actually been in touch, and there have been a lot of discussions around what can we take as learning from the overall COVID response, as well as the new challenges of social unrest that's probably surrounding us all. And this is a moment of leadership. Malcolm and I have spoken many times about this on different perspectives, but I think this is where I invoked his saying last time that we talked, was like managers light fire under people, and leaders fire light in people, which I believe is sufficient motivation for us to curate the discussion today. So please welcome Malcolm Harkins, a dear friend of personal friend of mine, as well as for CFF. We will navigate through a number of topics today, and then we have within the next 30 minutes or so. Malcolm is the Chief Security and Trust Officer. I know the trust part was interesting for quite a few of you who reached back out, but this is becoming more and more of a norm. He's one of the pioneers in that space. This is not his first role as the Chief Security and Trust Officer. This is his second one, probably, right? So, Malcolm, welcome, and let's start with a little bit of your background, and you had a very long-winded way to this role, and and as a leader, please share your thoughts and a little bit of background, and then we'll dive into these topics that we had discussed.
Yeah, thanks, Val, and happy to be here, and again, thanks for your friendship and for everything that the Cyber Future Foundation does. So my background is simple on the one hand, complex on the other hand, depending upon how you look at it. The simple part is I've worked for 3 companies in 28, 29 years. I've got an undergraduate background in economics. I've got my MBA in finance and accounting. And then straight after my MBA, I went to work for Intel and in procurement, and then finance, and then business operations for the first 10, 11 years of my career. And then in the summer, fall of 2001, some significant events occurred, 9/11 physically, and then Code Red and NIMDA from the logical perspective. Andy Grove was still running Intel, and frankly, he was beating the shit out of the corporate officers to deal with the availability risk issues. And Intel CIO called me up and asked me to run security and business continuity. And the dialogue was basically, okay, I don't really know much about security. and I understand some of the basics of it. I understand corporate risk, but I'm not a security expert. I'm not a technologist by background. He knew that, and he's like, well, that's fine. I've got a bunch of security who don't know anything about the business. They'll teach you and you'll teach them. And so that's how I, landed in security. And, from that point, late 2001 till I left Intel in 2015, I ended up putting my arms around every aspect of risk, security controls, compliance-related things, particularly with technology. So I was overseeing all of the typical IT and information security type items. I also oversaw product security, so all the security development lifecycle and privacy by design for Intel's products and services worldwide. And I also ran the corporate emergency operations team. That was a part of the physical security team. So I had kind of physical reach, logical reach, and then the product side of it. And then I dabbled in ethics and social responsibility and a few other things. And then when I left Intel, I went to go work for Cylance as their chief security and trust officer, and left there about a year ago, a quarter or so after the acquisition by BlackBerry. And then I've been at Cymatic as their chief security and trust officer since late July, early August of last year, so coming up on a year.
Thank you, Malcolm, for that background. I think this kind of reinforces what we have been speaking even through this last several sessions, is that the road to cybersecurity and the career path is not a straight line, and the more diverse background actually you have is better and more helpful to give you a broader perspective. So with that, you mentioned about your initial engagement on the business continuity side as well, right? And what do you see in the response so far? We have very few people who really had a playbook for responding to COVID, let alone the overall economic and social unrest that's out there, and how to deal with people, let alone the business itself, right? So what are your lessons, kind of learned? I know you've been speaking to a lot of our colleagues as I have been. So what are your takeaways for the last few months of response?
Yeah, well, again, you go back in my time at Intel, and like Andy Grove's book, Only the Paranoid Survive, mm-hmm. He, for a couple years, post 9/11 and post Code Red and Nimbus, for a couple years, a couple corporate officers and the leads for driving security and business continuity related stuff met with Andy every 2 weeks for his scrutiny across a variety of things. And so you roll back the clock, I was helping create and work with a pandemic response plan for Intel circa 2002. We did biohazard type responses. And so because we bound together physical, logical, product and business operations in their early stages. So for me, retrospectively, when I've seen what many peers have gone through, I was very thankful for, let's just say, the baptism I had with Andy Grove beating the crap out of all of us to really be prepared for things. Because, we have to go beyond just calculating risk. We have to contemplate it, right? And we're risk managers. And technology can create the risk or it can help manage it, right? And so what I found from interacting with a lot of what I'd say my traditional CISO peers is, if their organization had some type of draft pandemic thing, let's just say they really had something like that, IT wasn't a part of it, and InfoSec was even further away from it, right? Because it sat with HR and it sat with the facilities team, right? Maybe the physical security team or the corporate safety officer if you're in a manufacturing plant, right? But by and large, most people had never contemplated a pandemic and then needing to respond with everybody being remote, right? But I think they could have or should have, because when you think about it, we experience hurricanes, we experience floods, we experience earthquakes, we experience fires. Well, those are localized equivalent of nobody can come to work, mm-hmm. right? So how do you magnify that, right? Ransomware, my system's down, I'm all locked up, right? Well, that's the same thing. I can't do work. So how do I respond to, how do we recover from it? So we've got to hopefully, because of COVID-19, because of the shock wave that it's created across society, let alone our organizations, economically and the humanitarian side, we will have been forced into really looking at the kaleidoscope of risk as that. If we just look at one myopic hue, we're missing the contours, we're missing the color. And as a full organization, we've got to be playing with that kaleidoscope of risk so that we're not magnifying it, we're dialing it in the right way at the time we need to.
Well, I think you emphasized on probably one big change that has happened, right? I mean, earlier the number of stakeholders involved in business continuity, little on IT and cyber was very focused on specific, the physical elements of it, the human elements of it, not so much as the digital. And I think from what you have seen probably 20 years back to now is that there has also been, you were one of the early chief security officers and responsible for both security and cyber security. How do you see this evolution of the security component tied to the trust component, right, which has become very emphatic now, and there is those people who have this conversation around zero trust as well, right? So how does security and trust go together?
Well, so I look at it and I go, what is trust? Trust is a function of two things: competence and character, right? So we trust each other. Why? Because of the competencies you have and the character with which you take action to things. So that's how we develop trust in a relationship. That's how you look at trust vis-a-vis a consumer to a business or business to business relationship. And so for me, as every company, as every organization has become a technology company, and I've had this dialogue even years ago, with somebody, and they were like, "Hey, I'm a teacher in a school," and I'm like, "You're a technology company, whether you know it or not. You have a website, you probably have an app, you have people, you have all these systems that you're using in some way for the organization and to engage and to do certain things, right?" And they're like, "Yeah." And I go, "Well, you're a creator of technology. I was back at Intel. I'm making silicon, but you're also creating technology for use." Now, that's, different companies have had different life cycles on that. I think the one thing that's happened with COVID-19 is everybody's now awoken to the fact that they have to leverage technology to manage and mitigate risk. At the same time, again, technology creates risk, right? We saw that with, and I love Zoom, and when we're on Zoom, but we saw even with Zoom, because the rush to everybody on it, and all of a sudden, people are now claiming it's not secure, there's privacy issues and stuff like that, and it's just because of sometimes they didn't know how to use it, they didn't know how to configure it. In other cases, there was things perhaps that Zoom hadn't fully thought about in its evolution to be prepared for it to be critical infrastructure, right? In so many different ways. And so I think when I look at that and I bring it back to security and trust, at the end of the day, it's all about trust. Can I trust my employees? Can I trust the company? Can I trust my partners? And even back in my Intel evolution, the reason why I became Chief Security and Privacy Officer, the original concept was to be Chief Trust Officer. It's just Intel's CTO didn't want another CTO, right? And so, for me, it's always been together because that's how I've operated. It's just the title evolved over time, and to be honest, I'll give some kudos out to John Stewart, who just retired as the Chief Security and Trust Officer from Cisco, a longtime friend. I think he was probably the first Chief Security and Trust Officer,
right? And
because I, respect him and I respect how he was thinking, that's probably what caused me to first think about that as the evolution of where I wanted to define the role and how I managed it and how people viewed it.
Well, I think that speaks of how we emphasize on the specific components that could empower the role and the position, the responsibility you got, right? The emphasis on trust, not just security, but building the trust around. What is your take on, like, as we expand the perimeter of trust now, if you will, right? I mean, the enterprises are primarily now running on a remote workforce. Earlier, we were concerned about the remote infrastructure, which was pretty much the transition to cloud, and now the transition to remote workforce, which a lot of this will eventually stay, right? What is your guidance to other leaders when it comes to continuity of this new norm, which probably businesses will take advantage of, and also rightfully so. I mean, can leverage that you can work from anywhere you want. A lot of us had that luxury, not many, but now I think the organizations are taking on a more durable approach, if not permanent, on remote workforce. So what is your thought for these leaders?
Well, it's interesting. So I'll date it back with an Intel analogy and then bring it forward. So circa 2003, 2004, the first wireless laptop with built-in wireless, the Centrino platform, was launched, right? So back at that time period, even at Intel, it was 80% desktops, 20% laptops, because laptops were more expensive, right? And back in that time period, to get wireless access, because of budget constraints and the way in which IT got funded, it cost, and I'll be directionally correct, $50,000. IT would charge a business unit to light up a building with wireless, and then $10 per user per month in order to get them on wireless. And you know what that behavior that created? Everybody went to Fry's, Best Buy, Circuit City, and bought a access point for $50, plugged it into the network port, and I was playing whack-a-mole with rogue access points. Right. So I'm one of those views that we've got to run to the risky things to shape the path of the risk. Right. And even my own security team was kind of like, hey, mobility is risky. And I'm like, well, we can take a risk and manage a risk. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, if we do ubiquitous mobility, and I took money from an audit AR that I had, an audit action item that I had to go put in some AirWatch or something like that to go look for rogue access points. And I'm like, look, the problem with rogue access points is because we haven't built the capacity for ubiquitous, wireless mobile computing. People are just trying to get their jobs done. And because of the way in which we went about trying to raise the funding and do stuff, I was like, we created our own security problems. I was like, and if we give everybody laptops, create ubiquitous wireless, then the rogue ones are going to stand out. And then we're like, well, mobile is going to be riskier. And I'm like, why? And there's like data is going to be with them. I'm like, encrypt the hard drive. I can put a wireless access point that does network access control because I can build it in versus the ports under the desk. Deploying NAC in a wired LAN environment was expensive and backward looking instead of forward looking. And so sometimes I think we get ourselves wrapped around the axle, and we've just got to be more forward leaning towards things. And if we do that, we'll be able to lower the risk, because the security team, in my mind, as the risk managers, should be the first adopters of the riskiest thing. Why? Because then they can kind of paint the path for everybody to follow down to best manage and mitigate the risk, instead of IT being the laggard and then security being behind that. I'm like, look, be a first mover. If you're a first mover, you'll be able to shape the path. And if you shape the path, again, you can, to my catchphrase, protect to enable, right? And then if you have that mentality, I think it really does remove a lot of impediments. And it really does allow you to manage and mitigate a much wider variety of risk issues.
Well, certainly so. And Malcolm, you probably experienced this yourself, that while we want to do all that, and needless to say, I think a lot of the leading security leaders who have been on the cusp of things and of emerging technologies, being supportive of that, have always stood out because they have been ready for that change and embrace it before even businesses do, right? But here I'll put two issues forward, for your thoughts. One is that there is a huge democratization of IT, and with cloud services, we started off with having too much shadow IT to manage, right? Which became one of our major challenges. Secondly, if we were to follow the bleeding edge and leading edge, we need to have the capacity in terms of people who can actually support these two, right? So how do you recommend leaders to balance these two, to stay ahead of the curve, to make sure that they have the they have a sense of what's coming and throw resources, but those resources themselves are hard fought, right? So how do you balance?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. I don't want to minimize that, and I've certainly had those challenges of budget constraints, people constraints, and stuff like that. But I also have a view that innovation can come from starvation, right? So sometimes sometimes we create our own problem because I constantly have to say, well, I need more, I need more, I need more. Well, that's part of our own problem. We've, on the security side, we've kind of built this feature economy that has added complexity, it's added cost. Right. And in many ways, it hasn't managed the risks. So if we start inwardly looking first and saying, where are my controls insufficient or flawed? Get rid of them. Where are my controls creating inefficiency in our business process execution? And if I tweak the control or do some things, do I deliver business value? And if I deliver business value, will the business then fund me to go do things? And because I start that way, as well as the fact that I look at everybody's my budget. I don't just look at my departmental budget. I think of total cost, right? And because I do that, it gives me much more freedom to think about things. If I don't have the expertise, somebody else might. And if I'm willing to take a risk and enable, again, we talk about shadow IT. Why does shadow IT exist? Because IT is too slow. They want to charge me for something and I can get it cheaper outside. That's still an issue. Again, why would people go to Circuit City or Best Buy to buy an access point to light it up for wireless? Why? Because IT wasn't doing it for me, right? And so I look at it and I still say that's a structural issue. And if you change the structure, structure drives behavior and you get what you measure, right? And if you change structurally how you go about things, you'll change the behaviors not only in your organization, but in the organizations that we're supporting.
Sure. Right, and I think rightly said in the sense that the structure driving behavior, so that you can actually have metrics that you can measure, right? I mean, these are all kind of all follow each other. One thing that we've been tracking, in fact, right before speaking with you, I got a call, a long kind of strategic discussion with one of our friends from the healthcare sector, and I'll say that because it's fresh off my memory, right? That there is a debate around automation and actually pulling people in, directing cyber talent on specific areas versus automating, right? Both has their pros and cons in terms of if we automate, and I've seen many bad processes being automated, a lot of garbage data thrown into it, right? So there's a challenge there itself. But what is your take on the debate between automation and cyber capacity? Because now it's also an inflection point as we have a very scaled problem to assess and respond to in terms of at least the remote workforce problem. We have to put people back on work. We can potentially attract people who are out of work and redeploy them into cyber, and also eventually. Probably we can solve big problems through automation that people, that the problems that can be solved through automation, we don't need to put people there, but we may need to, right? In terms of affecting the processes well, making sure the data is well. So what's your take on automation versus putting people to talent to?
Yeah. So this is going to sound maybe a little bit crass, but a fool with the tool is still a fool. If you don't know what you're doing, automating it isn't going to help. Now, but let's take this a little bit more broadly, right? Let's look at information technology. It's automation, right? And the use of technology should be to deliver a business outcome, and that business outcome, if you're a for-profit business, is increased revenue or lowering costs, right? If I deploy automation in a factory, it's because I want to lower product cost and I want to get yield out of my factory, right? And so, growing up in a manufacturing company, that's what automation is meant to do, create yield, right? Either at the top line or the bottom line. And when I look at it that way, you could argue in many cases, we haven't gotten yield out of our security investments, right? Because risk has been growing unchecked and unmitigated in many cases. But when you look at the labor shortage that we have, right? The only way in which I know how to bring that back in balance is to focus it like an economist would, because that's my background. How do I get yield, right? Because I can't go hire the workforce if all the numbers of millions of people are, we're short. We have to solve that, and we have to grow the security talent. But at the same time, we're going to have to use automation, and use automation with real outcomes, right? We have to get yield out of our investments. And if we get the yield out of it, then we'll be able to solve it. At the same time, I do believe that sometimes we're better suited with a human in the position of reviewing things, making a decision. But at the same time, like I said, I don't want to throw bodies at it. So it becomes, for me, really just an economic choice. If you again go back to my Intel days, as the early 2000s were growing and we're instrumenting for things and stuff like that, we built our SOC. But guess what? For follow the sun, for extensibility and multi-language as well as cost, we built our security operations center in Costa Rica and in Penang, Malaysia. And I did that because I could leverage manufacturing talent and technical talent, which gave me reach into the manufacturing environment. It gave me a lower total cost. It gave me multinational, multi-language coverage, follow the sun. And then I had people in the US and other parts of the world. But I looked at it from an economics, I looked at it from a labor, because I needed to throw bodies at it initially, right? And how could I do that most effectively? And then leverage the existing footprint that Intel had, and again, grow talent that were manufacturing technicians or manufacturing automation folks into the security talent that we needed for our security operations.
Yeah, that's interesting, because initially, unless you know the problem properly and kind of get to the bottom of it to effectively address it, automation only will provide so much for us, right?
Exactly, and I think many of us in the security industry, because of just the nature of the beast, we are playing a short game all the time, right? We're very, very, very tactical. And again, growing up on the finance side, having an economics background, I think at a macro level, and then because of the strategic planning stuff that I did, I've always tried to think out 2, 3, 4, 5+ years down the road, right? To make sure that the choices I'm making tactically are also enabling me towards a strategic vision, right? From an architecture perspective, from a labor cost perspective, from a yield perspective.
Right. So I think you have seen from your experiences, as I learned, that both the human way of solving this, which continues on and will continue, and the automated way of solving things, and how to bring them about together, right? Any specific guidance as we are trying to fill the ranks and file of security organizations, and try to reorient, maybe some of those that are looking for a different kind of job now that they may have a opportunity to change tracks and get into a more lucrative area such as security. Any specific aptitude we would be looking for in those that we want to bring into cybersecurity?
Yeah, well, it's almost the similar thing, but applied differently for any role that I've ever had. I don't know if you've ever read the Patrick Lencioni books. He does fables on leadership and stuff. They're good books. Anyways, one of the books that he wrote a few years ago was called, I think it was called The Ideal Team Player. And he talked about the ideal team player had 3 characteristics. They were hungry, humble, and smart. Mm-hmm. You got somebody hungry, they've got that, I just want to go learn it. I want to go do it. I've got that inner passion that you just need to unleash and shape, right? Humble, you don't want a bunch of, idiots and assholes running around. You want people who can work with people, right? And then smart. If you hire smart people, they'll figure it out. And so first and foremost is go look for hungry, humble, and smart people. And then you go look for people in adjacent areas, right? You might have somebody, and I did this at Intel, I did it at Silence, I'll do it at Cymatic as we grow. You get somebody who's a network engineer, right? Well, you can shift somebody from a network engineer into a network security person. If I'm a database person, well, guess what? Databases is where a lot of sensitive data is stored and stuff like that. So you can take people with technical talent and grow them, right? But you have to invest in them. And you either compete for talent or you grow talent. And I tend to focus on how do I grow talent, because then I don't have to compete for it. And if I've grown talent and I've given people opportunities, I've shown them loyalty, I give them work that matters, they're sticky with me. Yeah. In which case, every time I've had a job opening, I've never had to pay a recruiter. Why? Well, because I've always been constantly recruiting, and I've always been trying to constantly grow people, and that creates a built-in pool of talent that always wants to join what you're doing.
Absolutely, that I'm living through that, so completely vouch for that attitude. Well, as we are kind of towards the bottom of the hour, I've probably one more question primarily, question, and also kind of get your thoughts on and motivation on, like, as soon as we hit the pandemic, and this is specifically to your current role. I mean, Cymatic and your company went out and started offering free software to small and medium businesses, not profit. I mean, that really struck a chord with me, because I didn't really see, it's an underserved sector of the industry, and the economy is not really, doesn't have the resources or the budget like big organizations. What motivated you or your leadership to go solve that problem during this crisis, when you'd be looking for probably bigger prizes and organizations that afford it, right?
Well, it gets back to that trust thing, right? And despite being at a startup, that doesn't mean we can't give back. It doesn't mean we can't help out people. I had a notion, again, years ago, of a security poverty line that exists. I was always above the poverty line. The poverty line was caused by two things: budget, right, and the pure economics, or the other thing that we were talking about, talent, right? Do I have the technical talent? And at Intel, I had a massive budget. I had hundreds of people. Yeah, I always had budget constraints, but I was well above the poverty line, right? Even joining Silence as when it was young, I was well above the poverty line. Why? Because we had a breadth and depth of talent. We were well funded, and what I needed to do with my team was just punch above my weight limit, use automation, use our smarts, re-architect and reinvent, because I had a greenfield, so I didn't have to go down the same path that I had at Intel. I could start from scratch and then literally get way more yield out of what I was doing. And the same thing with Cymatic, right? Again, it's a reimagination, a reinvention of how to approach web application security. And in doing that, in recognizing there is a poverty line that exists, we can help people address that problem, that are struggling with it. Whether it be a nonprofit with a website that's collecting donations, if that thing gets taken over and shut down and fraud occurs, they could go out of business, right? And then think of the impact that would have on the humanitarian things that they're doing, right? Or remote workers. We've had some use cases where, again, and I think we've all experienced, where overnight you've got to punch out all of your employees to work remotely indefinitely. We had one organization that literally 50% of their employees were still on desktops in a semi-clean room environment, considering the sensitive data they were handling. And within 72 hours, they had to be remote to be able to have the continuity of operations. So what did they do? They basically said, well, I can't afford to go buy laptops, and it's going to take weeks to do that. then I can't go, it's going to cost me a ton of money to go buy the Microsoft Suite, VPN software, all these other things, and weeks before I could enable it. They stuck up a portal, put us on the front end of the portal, and enable BYOD on the home devices because we can inspect the device and its hygiene, the geolocation, a bunch of other things that gave them a level of assurance that Malcolm's system was up to standards for hygiene. Malcolm's credentials were good and not compromised or vulnerable. It was Malcolm on the other side of it, and it was in an appropriate location. And then once we, vetted all that stuff, then they deployed a virtual desktop environment to further, limit the attack surface. But they did that in hours with us, versus what would have cost them, millions of dollars in weeks to enable in the old-fashioned way. And so, again, you can use this, again, innovation coming through starvation. How do you take a constraint, right, and then transform your thinking because of the constraints that you're under? And, it can't always happen, but I've seen it over and over again as a path to leap ahead instead of perpetuating a step behind and just the incremental approach of what I have today is what I'm stuck with. And I've just got to continue to Band-Aid, bubblegum, and baling wire it together.
Well, that's very uplifting. And again, I really admire not only just your personal leadership, but how you've applied to the business principles and the philosophy, helping small, medium businesses and nonprofit who probably cannot afford the level of security that others can, but are a part of the, important part of the society as well as the economy is extremely important. Running a nonprofit here ourselves, we run into significant challenges within cybersecurity, and we want to keep our footprint, secure. So I really appreciate that. Thank you, Malcolm, for all your wise words, and it's always a pleasure talking to you. I always look out for those quotes, and it's innovation comes through starvation is the quote of the day, right? What can we learn from today and take away for tomorrow is essentially what makes us better. So thank you, Malcolm, and thanks for everyone for joining. We will conclude today's program with the announcement that we're going to come back next week with Dr. Nasir Memon from NYU. He's going to be talking about his response as an academician and an administrator in a large academic organization trying to respond back to the students' needs. And then you've probably been tracking as the new trends and new opportunities to actually engage students, especially in the cybersecurity, how to bounce back from the traditional means of educating in the classrooms back to online and making it productive and fulfilling. So we will have another interesting topic. For today, I thank Malcolm. I thank all of you. It's great to have you all and continue the discussion.
Thank you, Val.
Thank you, sir. Cheers. Bye.